Oh, yeah. Dig that Playboy Channel jazz. Oh, geez. Hey, here I am. It's Carl Franklin. And welcome to the last Blazor Desk Show. I know. Carl, what are you doing? I came and I learned all about Blazor from the Blazor Desk Show, and now you're going off the air. Well, not quite. We're starting something new in May, and that is essentially everything. I mean, my whole 2-day workshop and more combined in lots of little videos, and we're calling it Blazor Train. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that, but don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. This is all good news. Let's just get on with it, shall we? Tonight, for the next 2 hours, and I say tonight because it's nighttime where I am, for the next 2 hours, I'm going to show you a whole bunch about Blazor, Blazor Server, Blazor Client. We're going to learn what the difference is between those two things. And hopefully by the end of it, you will have a really good idea of how to proceed with your own projects and where to use Blazor and what it's good for, what it's not good for. And, you know, hopefully you'll be successful at it. I think you will be. So before we go any further, I want to acknowledge my sponsor, DevExpress. Without them, I wouldn't be able to deliver this content to you. They happily are supporting me in all my Blazor endeavors, and there's a good reason. They have some Blazor controls that they want to share with you for free, and if you go to devexpress.com/free Blazor, you can download those. It's good stuff. I've been using it in my own projects, and that's why I feel really good about their tools and the company. They've been supporting developers since Delphi. They've been doing controls for 20 years, and those controls are still supported. So thank you, DevExpress. And by the way, there are some DevExpress people in the chat room on YouTube and on Twitch to field any questions you have about anything. Blazor, their stuff, whatever. It's all the same. So here we go. I'm going to share everything I know, within reason, in the next 2 hours, and definitely be prepared to drink from the fire hose. Right now I'm drinking from the water bottle. But imagine a water bottle, except it's a fire hose. Okay? And there's going to be a lot of information coming at you fast and furious, but I'm not going to leave you in the dust. You don't have to take pictures and screenshots and snapshots of links and everything, because you can go to blazordeskshow.com and download everything that I'm showing you here today, tonight, this afternoon, whatever it is. Hey, holler out in the chat rooms if you're from far away. I'm in New England. Let's hear where you are out there. Okay, here we go. So we're going to start with what Blazor is. What is it? Well, most people think it's C# in the browser and leave it at that. And yeah, that sort of was the impetus for Blazor. Steve Sanderson showed off this little gizmo that he had put together a couple of years ago, where he was running C# in the browser using WebAssembly, which was fairly new at that point. But some companies were compiling for it. We'll talk more about WebAssembly in a minute. But it turned into much more than that. It turned into a component model. And the component model is a way to package up HTML and C# code in assemblies and then share them. Share them on NuGet, reuse them in different projects, in the same project. Essentially a page, a Blazor page or a Razor page. Yeah, it's confusing. Those are essentially Blazor components. And so a page is a component, and a component is a smaller piece of what a page is, okay? And you can have components nested inside each other, and it's just a very nice, cohesive way to build software as a C# developer, especially for the web, which is something that, we have been, it's been lacking in C# or in .NET web stuff, really in terms of, the seamless kind of experience that we had with designers and all of that stuff. since Silverlight, really. We haven't been able to run C# in the browser since then. But, okay, I said the S word. I said the Silverlight word. Yes, there's speculation out there from those who are not informed, and it is definitely the uninformed, that Silverlight might just be the next. That Blazor WebAssembly might be the next Silverlight, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And the reason is because WebAssembly isn't Silverlight, because WebAssembly is a standard virtual machine that's cross-platform, that's built into every browser. And I mean every browser, even Safari, iOS browser has WebAssembly built into it. The only things that don't are browsers that have been, where the development on them has been stopped and the innovation has stopped, such as Internet Explorer, which they stopped working on that and went to Edge, before WebAssembly was a thing. That's what I meant to say. But you can rest assured that WebAssembly is a standard part of every modern browser, and it's cross-platform, and it works like a champ. And it is a virtual machine. It's capable of running binary code. And if you compile your code to WebAssembly, you can run it in a browser, no matter what the language was that created that binary. And so there's a whole bunch of languages that run in WebAssembly, not just C#. We have Rust, we have Golang, there's Python, C++, all sorts of languages. In fact, the list is growing every day. Just Google Bing it, and you'll see what I mean. So another reason that Blazor is not Silverlight is because, well, and when people say that, what's wrong with Silverlight? Well, nothing wrong with it, except that, Microsoft screwed me on it, right? Which is what I hear, and I'm not saying that from my perspective. What really happened was Silverlight, like Flash, got into the browser with the plugin model, and the plugin model turned out to be insecure, and Flash turned out to be a battery sucker for iPhones and iPads. And so that combination meant that Steve Jobs would no longer support the plugin model on iOS devices in Safari. And because of that, Silverlight became a casualty, right? Because if there's no plugins, there's no Flash, which was his reason for getting rid of it. But also, there's no Silverlight. And if we can't write code that works in the browser and isn't going to work on the hottest platform of the day, the iPhone, then what's the point? So a lot of other browsers followed suit, and they also got rid of the plugin model in their browsers. So ever since then, it's been JavaScript, 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 JavaScript. I love JavaScript. So how many people love JavaScript? Give me a hey-ho, hi. And this is the first time I'm looking up the chats, and I see hi from Canada, hello from Peru, hi from Colombia, and hi from Korea. Wow, okay. So nobody from Cincinnati? Nobody from Connecticut? Okay. Well, anyway, yeah, so how many people like JavaScript? How many people are here because they hate JavaScript and they want to use C# instead? Yeah, crickets. That's right. All right. So, yes, you can write C# and it'll run in the browser, but it's more than that. In fact, with these components, those same components will run on the server side as well as in the browser. And there's some magic that makes that happen, and that's what we're going to discover here in a minute. Argentina. Excellent. Wow. Peru, Argentina, Colombia. We got this Central America and South America thing going here, which is very cool. So this server magic is we're going to talk about in a minute. It's SignalR. That's the magic that makes it happen. But here's the thing. This same markup in code will run in either place, but you need to pick a horse. When you create a Blazor project, that's when you decide which hosting model you're going to use. Are you going to do a Blazor server application or a Blazor WebAssembly application? Now, you can use the same markup and code in either place, but at the project level, when you create a project, that's when you make that decision. Okay? Now, I'm going to show Brantford, Connecticut, Rich Burgess. Great. We have a Connecticutite. But I'm going to show you a way to develop both a server-side Blazor application and a client-side Blazor application at the same time. Bet you didn't expect that. All right, that's coming up here in a little bit, on the hour, I believe, if I time it right. So let's continue on and talk about when you create a new project. Like I said, you have the option of creating a Blazor server or a Blazor WebAssembly project. But you can only build a WebAssembly project if you've installed a preview of WebAssembly, because it's not in the box yet. In fact, it's not shipping until .NET 5, which will be in November. But it will be at the end of May, sort of RTM. All right, so release to manufacturing. So it'll be done at the end of May. There might be a few bug fixes and stuff like that before it goes live in the box in .NET 5. But, you know, for now, the preview works great, and the component model is completely baked. In other words, it isn't going to change. So the code you write today with the preview of WebAssembly is going to work exactly the same when on the shipping version. So what you got to do is go to wasm.blazordeskshow.com. I made a nice little URL for you there to get you to St. Charles, Missouri, and Florida. All right, cool. Keep it up. I want to hear where you're all from. I made this little URL for you, wasm.blazordeskshow.com, which is going to bring you to the latest version of WebAssembly. So Blazor WebAssembly, so that it has all the instructions to install it. So there's 3 parts to it. You need to install the latest .NET Core 3.1, which is also going to be a preview version. You need to install the latest Visual Studio 2019 preview version, and the community version works just fine. So definitely the 2019 preview, not regular old Visual Studio 2019. Okay, and then you need to install the Blazor WebAssembly template, which you can do at the command line. And as I said before, just follow that link, wasm.blazordeskshow.com, and it shows you how to install everything. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between these two hosting models, starting with the server. And then we'll compare that to the client. All right, so the server hosting model doesn't use REST calls to go back and forth. This is a UI framework, right? So this isn't a replacement for this isn't a replacement for Web API, you know, or where you have code that runs on the back end and code that runs on the front end. We're talking about UI interaction. So when I click a button, we're going to the server to run code that you want to run behind that button click, right? Your event handlers happen on the server, even though they're all in the component with the markup. And SignalR gets in there, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, but it's a persistent WebSocket that's a connection that stays persistent. It stays open. And all of the traffic between the browser and the server goes across SignalR. Hi from Sydney, Australia. Awesome. I'm not even going to try to pronounce your handle there, but I will. Grub Roots Fat Chicks. I don't know. That's okay. If you want to explain that, go right ahead, but you don't have to. Don't feel compelled that you have to explain that. All right, so rather than looking at all this, let's just quickly look at a diagram here so that you can see, yes, indeed, SignalR has put itself right in .NET Core 3.0. So when you create a new Blazor server project, you get a SignalR hub that is behind the scenes that does all of the communication between the browser and the server. And you don't have access to it. You don't get to use it for your own SignalR purposes. If you want your own SignalR hub, you can just make your own SignalR hub and add it. This isn't for you. This is for Blazor. Okay? And remember what I said. Blazor is a UI framework. It's analogous to Angular or React or Vue or any of those that essentially wires up and binds data to your UI. And that data comes from code. Change the code, change the UI. So what we're going to do is move over to I'm going to move over to the remote desktop capture I have here with Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new application, a new Blazor app, and I'm going to call this Blazor Server. And I'll make sure that it's in the right directory here. Blazor Server. I don't know, it just came to me. And now I get these options here. I have options to install a Blazor Server app or a Blazor WebAssembly app. And I only see this second option if I've installed that template, that WebAssembly template. Okay? There it is, Blazor Server app. I'm going to go ahead and create. And here we go. Now, right out of the gate, when you create a Blazor Server application with Visual Studio, you can just run it and you get this sort of little demo of a couple of different pages that you can try out. And I'll show you what they are. First of all, there's the index page, which is the default page. You can see this is the root directory here. And then you have this counter where you can click a button and click me and it increments a counter. And you have fetch data, which goes and gets some data. How it gets that data is different depending on whether this is a Blazor Server app or a Blazor WebAssembly app. I'll leave it at that for now. But let's look at counter. Notice that when I went to fetch data and then back to counter, it reset my current count to 0. What's that all about? Well, just remember that happened, and I'll explain that later. But let's take a look at the code. In the code, whoops, the index is pretty simple. I won't spend any time on that, but counter is the first one we have here with an interaction. All right. So it's a page. So pages get a @page directive at the top with the route to it. And when you create a new page and you name it, you're going to get that route right there. You can pass parameters. We'll talk about that in a bit. But here we go. I've got this current count right here in a code block. It's defined as a private integer, current count. And it's initialized to 0. And then I have this button with an @onClick equals. And then it says to call increment count. Now this is a server-side. Yes, .NET does rock, Rich. This is a server-side call, increment count. And it's that that makes the difference between, hey, this is a JavaScript call, where if I take that out, now the DOM is looking for a JavaScript increment count method. But I put that in there and it turns green, and now we're going to be calling increment count here. So what actually happens when I press that button? Because this is magic. I mean, look at this. There's no plumbing code here at all, right? It is magic. It looks like magic anyway. So in order to find out what's really going on, let's pull up the network tools. And I'm going to disable the cache right there. And I'll start recording events. And I'm just going to press Control F5. And we'll see what loads in the browser. Now, first of all, down at the bottom, you can see not much. 165K. Right? That's not a lot. I have GIF files that are bigger than that. JPEG files. Certainly PNG files. But let's take a look at this. Underscore Blazor. Question mark. ID equals blah 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 blah. It's a WebSocket. Blazor is essentially, it's an abstraction over WebSockets, but it also will fall back to older browser technologies if WebSockets aren't available. So it's essentially a way of establishing a communication link or a socket between two endpoints, a client and a server, and the server can push data to the client can send data to the server, and then you can, and since it's kept alive, there's this communication that goes back and forth. But what is that communication? Well, if you actually click on this, we can take a look. Now, this isn't telling us what the data is, but it's certainly saying that the first thing that was sent was a message that we're using this protocol Blazor Pack, which is the protocol, a binary protocol that the Blazor team created for Blazor. And now you can see there's some binary messages coming down and going up and coming down, going up and coming down. But I'll just clear this and then press the button again. And now we'll go see what happened. And by the way, there's no assemblies being downloaded here. This is all very light, right? There's some JavaScript, Bootstrap, CSS, there's some other stuff, the icon or whatever. All right, so when I click that button, the browser sent this message, a 291 bytes. Well, what actually sent that? So if you take a look here in underscore host.cshtml, this is where we're defining this JavaScript. We're linking this JavaScript file here, blazor.server.js. So its job is to handle the DOM and hook things like button clicks and send messages to Blazor. And then when it gets messages over SignalR, and when it gets messages over SignalR from Blazor, it updates the DOM. All right? So that's what its job is. So yeah, now you can see we have these hello, keep alive messages, right? So click the button. That JavaScript hooks the DOM and says, this is for the server, packages up a Blazor Pack binary message, sends it up to the server. The server says, this is, where are we here? Counter. This is an increment count. I have to run that. So the server then executes increment count, which changes some code state. And since this value that changes is part of the DOM, the server notices this and says, there's a change. And how does it do that? Well, it actually keeps a graph of the client's DOM in memory. All right, so every single client, it keeps a graph of their document object model for the page they're on in memory. And it executes the code against its graph, finds the difference, in other words, what changed, packages those changes up, sends them back to the browser updates. And as you can see, that's what this last message is. Right there. So, message on the button click, server executes increment count, something has changed, sends a message back down to the browser sends back a, got it, everything's cool, we updated everything. So that's the interaction and the magic that happens. And you can actually watch it happening here. Now, if you want to do some advanced logging of SignalR traffic, just go to my blog, blog.appvnext.com, and you can see here that I've got a blog post where I hooked the WebSocket, and we can actually see the messages that go over, not just the length of the messages, but the messages themselves. Okay. So let's talk about scaling. Because with Blazor Server, think about it, all the stuff happens on the server. So so the client can stay thin, right? All the code happens on the server. You got this round trip going on, and you have a certain amount of memory required to support every client. And in fact, it's about 85K, or at least it was when I did my research. It might be less now. It's going to be less, if anything. And so you need to think about, well, that server then, since it's the center of the universe, how do I scale that? Well, there's two ways to scale, as you probably know. You can scale up, which means adding more memory, more CPU, and that's certainly doable, and you'll be able to support more clients if you do that. And then there's scaling out, and scaling out means having a cluster, having more machines, and allowing those machines to handle requests. That's a bit trickier and requires a bit more state management and things like that, which we will talk about. So knowing that memory is a precious resource, it just makes sense not to load up 1 million rows or 1 million objects in a list and bind them to a list box or a drop down or something like that, and then let the user pick and choose and scroll through the stuff that they want. It's standard, standard practice. Don't do that. Enough said. WebSockets are also a precious resource, and there is a limit, and it's limited by memory and CPU. And so on the same box, if you add more memory and more CPU, you'll be able to handle more clients. But if you really want to scale out, or you just want to remove the SignalR part from Blazor Server, you can use SignalR Service. So Azure SignalR Service is a SignalR server, sort of, but it's the server part, it's the hub, but it lives outside in Azure space somewhere. And so it doesn't matter where it is, your Blazor app connects to it and your clients connect to it, and now you've got this ability to, now it's out of the server, it's out of the Blazor server, and that's good, and that's required if you're going to scale out. Okay, so just you can Google Bing that or download the slides and you'll have that link. So this is a really good slide that I stole from Dan Roth. Microsoft on the Blazor team, they did a test with a real application. This was not your counter application. This was a real app that had considerable UI. And they wanted to see how many clients they could add clicking a button once a second before the latency of SignalR, the round trip, went above 200 milliseconds. 200 milliseconds is sort of a magic number. If you click a button and within 200 milliseconds you see a result, your brain thinks, I did that, I made that happen. But if it's more than 200 milliseconds, your brain starts to think, is the browser broken? Is my network down? What's going on? Why am I not getting a reaction here? I clearly did something and I don't see a result. Why is that? So it gets a little weird after above 200 milliseconds. So essentially what they did was they kept adding users clicking a button once a second. And like I said, it was a real app. So the results, well, with a machine that had 1 virtual CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM, they were able to comfortably host 5,000 clients on one box. No SignalR service, no nothing, just one VM in Azure. If they put that same app on a machine with 4 virtual CPUs and 14 gigs of RAM, they could comfortably host 20,000 concurrent clients, all clicking once a second before the latency went above 200 milliseconds. Okay? So available memory is the primary bottleneck, CPU is the secondary bottleneck, and the real app, of course, depends on your behavior, your network conditions, all of that. But this is a really good benchmark for you to start thinking about, well, do we want to scale out? Do we want to scale up? What do we want to do? Maybe we don't even want to scale up. Maybe 5,000 concurrent clients is enough for us. You know, who knows? It's up to you. Just putting the numbers out there. So let's talk about the upsides and the downsides of Blazor Server, you know, in comparison to Blazor WebAssembly, which we'll do in a minute here. So on the plus side for Blazor Server, the download size is significantly smaller than a Blazor WebAssembly app, and the app loads much faster. You're on the server, and that gives you a whole bunch of benefits when all the code is running on the server as a developer. First of all, you have access to all of the APIs your heart desires. All the code, all the NuGet packages, anything at all that you can run on the server will run and be code. The server environment, you get to take advantage of that. You get to be able to access things like databases directly. Blazor, Azure storage, all sorts of cloud services that require keys and secrets and permissions and things like that. You can access those. I mean, you know what it's like. You've been probably doing ASP.NET, either web forms or MVC coding for a long time. It's very nice being able to run everything on the server. You don't have to make an API layer. For example, if you're going to just grab some data and bind it to some UI elements that are going to be shipped down to the server. So that way. Think of it like JavaScript. Would you put secrets in JavaScript? Would you put your algorithms that are secret to your secret sauce to generating revenue or any of that stuff? Would you put those in JavaScript and send them to the client? No. Would you send database connection strings to the client? No. So why would you do that in C#? You just have to be careful. The code that you write in Blazor, C# should be UI code only. Any real heavy lifting, well, okay, in WebAssembly, with Blazor WebAssembly. With Blazor WebAssembly, it's all UI code. Blazor Server, you can mix it up, right? Because nobody's ever going to see it. I guess that's what I meant. But even if you were doing a WebAssembly application, still, the only code that you should be writing is UI code. And going to take just a second to look at my outputs here and make sure that I'm going. Somebody's mentioning that I've got buffering going on, and I don't know why. I'm looking at my streaming settings here, and I don't see any issues. So I don't think it's me. And sorry about that, guys. Anyone else out there getting buffering or a stream that's starting and stopping? Let us know. Had some buffering, but seems better now. Okay. We'll cross our fingers. I know I paid my internet bill. All right, let's talk about the downsides of Blazor Server. So there's this latency. And the latency is, you always have latency, but you're adding latency of the round trip. Okay, here's a question. Is there a risk that server code leak if there's an exception? No. You know why? Because if there's an unhandled exception, everything stops. Your application comes to a halt. It no longer works. So nobody can continue to use it and see your code. There's no yellow screen of death that shows your code, right? There's none of that. So if you have an unhandled exception, you get this little thing across the bottom that says there was an unhandled exception, you know, please reload or something like that. So that's a great question. Server code cannot leak. Okay, so on the downsides, you have this added latency because of SignalR. And there's always latency when you're making a call to a server, but you have this added step. Before it gets to the server and the server executes the code, has to go to the SignalR hub. SignalR hub has to call your, get the message. Blazor has to get the message from that hub and then do something with it. So every interaction requires a network hop, and that means a button click, a list box selection, a checkbox, anything like that. Heck, you could even do it on keystroke. So there's no offline support. As I said before, if that client connection fails, the app just stops working. Unhandled exception, same thing, just it stops working. The scalability challenges are real, and I mentioned those in the last slide when we talked about scaling. Scaling up, okay. Scaling out, a little more work. And an ASP.NET Core server is required to serve the app. So there's no way, unlike with Blazor WebAssembly, you can't just package it up and put it on a CDN. Okay? Getting back to the... All right, never mind. I was going to talk about the streaming stuff, but it's fine. All right, so before we move on, are there any issues or questions about Blazor server side? That was a great question, though. Risk that server code could leak. I want some other great questions. Come on, you guys. Any questions at all? I'll just wait a second or a minute. Play the music. Okay, never mind that. Can anyone speak to how the latency affects their users for an intranet app? That's good. Well, I mean, let's think about it. If you're on an intranet and you have latency, there's one of two reasons. One reason is your server isn't beefy enough, and two, the network infrastructure isn't beefy enough. In other words, there could be bad switching, there could be, a problem with the internet, with the intra network, right? That could be a problem. So one of those two problems will cause latency on an intranet app. Now you're talking about, we have a server in the closet and it's through our intranet. We're accessing it all behind a firewall and there's latency. So the first thing I would look at is, the memory and CPU of the server. Is it getting overloaded? But it's probably more likely going to be a networking issue. So latency will affect the users like this, no matter where they are, intranet, internet, wherever. If the SignalR hub interaction is taking too long, you click a button and nothing happens, right? So this could be really bad. Like if you are adding to cart, let's say, right? And you're selecting, a $5,000 laptop, let's say, and you add it to cart and you go to check out and you're checking out, placing your order, and nothing happens. Okay, well, now obviously you've got a problem here. Do you wait until it tells you something happened, or do you click it again? Users are stupid. They're evil. They will click it and click it and click it. And how many times are they placing that order? Right? So, okay. So Ducky is who asked that question. I was just asking if we have a decent network and server, should be no problem for a small company to use Blazor server. Yeah, no problem. Like I said, if there is latency, I would suspect the network first, and especially if it's an intranet application and you only have a couple hundred people tops using it, you're not going to have any problems. But those are the two places where you will run into trouble: networking and the server itself. Tom says, oh, first of all, Mario says, hello from Venezuela. How are you, sir? Tom says, can you create a solution that mixes Blazor server logic with WebAssembly logic? Or do you need to pick one or the other? I'm so glad you asked that question. Logic? No. But you can build an application, and we're going to do this in just a few minutes, where the component code, right? So the markup in the code is on the client, is in the client project. And then we have a server project, but instead of using the server project using its markup in code, it's going to use the client markup in code. So essentially what you can do is have one code base and then run it in the different environments. So you would select, you would have two browsers come up when you press F5 of multiple startup projects. One would be the server version, which is going to be the client markup in code, but running in the server. And the other is going to be the client. So yes, you can do that, but you wouldn't want to mix server logic with WebAssembly logic in the same project. It just doesn't make any sense because the logic has to run in one place or the other. When you click the button, is it going to run in the browser? Is it going to run on the server? You can't have some that runs in the server, some that runs in the browser. If you're going to do that, pick a WebAssembly application and then ship off whatever you want to the server with an API. Great question. All right, cool. So let's talk about WebAssembly. Obviously a much simpler hosting model because all of the code gets shipped down to the browser and it runs there, and there's no round trip necessary just for UI operations, and that's what's cool. Does have its drawbacks, and we'll talk about that. So, but before we do that, let's go back to Visual Studio here in our project, Blazor Server, and we're going to add a project to the solution. I'm going to add a new project, and it's also going to be a Blazor application, but this time it's going to be a Blazor WebAssembly application. I'm going to call it Blazor WASM. WASM is the extension for WebAssembly files, just like exe is the extension for Windows files. All right, so here's an undocumented feature of Visual Studio. You can notice that my WebAssembly template has gone away. If this happens to you, drop this thing down that says .NET Core 3.1, 3.0, select 3.0, and then go back to 3.1. And there it is. Shows up again, Blazor WebAssembly app. Now there's a couple things I want you to notice here. One is we have support for progressive web applications. Okay? That means if you check that, you can you'll get a manifest and you'll get a service worker and you can build out your progressive web app stuff from there. If you don't know about progressive web apps, learn. PWAs are a great way to install a web application onto a phone or a device, get offline support and caching, and also it goes, the icon goes on the home screen. So it looks just like an application. It's good stuff. Now, also you get this ASP.NET Core hosted option, and I'm going to check that off. If you don't check that off, if you don't check off the core ASP.NET Core hosted option, then you get one project, just the Blazor WASM client project right here. All right. And when you run that and set that as a startup project, it will just go into the browser and everything's fine. But it exists in an island. It's just the client. If you host it from a core ASP.NET Core server, now that server sends the client to the browser, right? When you go to that server, it sends the client app to the browser. And that server app can have API controllers. Really good. So then the client can access those API controllers with relative URLs. And in fact, that's exactly what happens here. Let me show you the fetch data. Remember we saw fetch data? Let's look at the code on the server side for fetch data and compare it to the client side. The app is going to look exactly the same, but let's look at the code. So here we're using code in the data folder. And in the data folder, there's this weather forecast service CS file. And we're injecting that into our page, into the fetch data page. And now we're using that to go out and pull in some data, right? We have this return value here, an array of weather forecast objects. And we're calling the forecast service get forecast async. It's a local object. That's what I'm getting at here. Go to the data folder. Here's the weather forecast service. It's just an object. It's a class, right? Because it's all on the server, we can just call into our data directly, whether it's a data manager or it's entity framework, DB context code, whatever it is. But if you go down to the client and you look at the client pages here, and we also have a fetch data. I look at this, and instead we're using an HTTP client to fetch data from an API, right? We're getting from JSON async a weather forecast array. Here's the URL. It's a relative URL, weather forecast. And that goes into this controller's controller, weather forecast controller. And that is just an API, right? So that's the difference between the two. The only difference between the two, if you look at the counter, it's exactly the same. And so is index, exactly the same. So you get these two, this Blazor WASM client and Blazor WASM server when you select that option, but you also get this shared file, which is just the .NET Standard project, and this is where models go. And it's a nice architecture. If you're going to build a WebAssembly application, it's good to have a server that you can just call into when you need something. Otherwise, you can set up a completely separate API server, or maybe you already have one, and you can just call that from your client. So let's modify this, and we'll set the Blazor WASM server project to be our startup project now. We'll run this. Now that's going to send the WebAssembly app into the browser where it's going to run. And let's just see what happens here. We'll pull up the network tools like we did before and observe what's being sent down. There's a lot of stuff there. Let's disable the cache and just do a refresh. Control F5. So we make sure we get everything. All right. So 6.5 megs were transferred here, expanding to 18 megs. Now, if you've been using Blazor WebAssembly templates before this, you might notice, oh, well, that went up. It was low before. It was lower. It was only a couple megabytes before. What happened? So in preview 3, I believe it was, they turned off the linker, they being Microsoft, turned the linker off in release mode. And the linker is what gets rid of all of the code that you're not actually calling. So let's do that. Before we go any further, I'm going to change debug mode to release mode up here. Run this guy again. And we're going to get a little modal from Visual Studio before that loads. Okay. Press F12, network. And again, I will disable the cache, press Control F5, and it turns out that we only got 2.1 megs. That's better. Now, 2.1 megs is better, but even 6 megs, like most SPA applications, SPA frameworks, give you a heck of a lot of stuff. I mean, Gmail sends you 5 megs of JavaScript and markup and stuff before you can even do anything. So right off the bat. So there you go. That's the difference. Now let's look at some of these things here. I'm going to sort them by size, starting at the top. And the biggest file is this, .NET WASM. What's that? That's the CLR. So that's a mono implementation of the CLR. It's cross-platform. That's compiled to WebAssembly. And that is the only WebAssembly binary in Blazor. That's it. You don't see any other WASMs here. Everything else is assemblies. Well, what kind of assemblies? What's the limitation? Any .NET Standard 2.0 assemblies will run. So if your project, you pull in a project from NuGet, if it's .NET Standard 2.0 compliant, it'll run. And that covers a whole lot of stuff. All right, so that's the big difference. Now, when you click on counter and the button and all that stuff, it doesn't show any activity because the code's running on the browser. There you go. So let's talk about the upsides and the downsides of the WebAssembly hosting model versus the server hosting model. Well, the code executes more quickly. You don't have that extra latency that's built in if, because you have to go round trip to SignalR. That is not a problem. There is offline support. You can use it as a PWA. It's a beautiful thing. Blazor WebAssembly as a PWA is a wonderful, wonderful solution. Because it doesn't require a server, you can package it up and distribute it with a content delivery network. Very, very easy to do, and saves you a bit of money too. And any .NET Standard 2.0 C# will run in the browser. So those are the upsides. The downsides. You have to build an API layer to do anything that requires secrets. I'm going to repeat that. You have to build an API layer to run any code that requires secrets. Data access, accessing Key Vault, accessing any Azure services, anything that requires a secret or a key or something that you don't want your clients to have access to, right? Debugging in Visual Studio is not quite complete for WebAssembly applications. Yes, you can set breakpoints and you can do some stepping, but there are certain things that you can't do. And for a list of those, go to wasm.blazordeskshow.com. You'll see the list of things there. It's still in preview. It will be RTM'd in May, as I said, and it'll ship with .NET 5 in November. Now, on the downside, again, I put this on here because, some people think this is an issue. Your code is sent to the client. So yes, people can look at your assemblies and they can decompile them and they can look at the source. You can obfuscate them just like you can do with assemblies that aren't running in the browser. And so obfuscated assemblies are harder to read when you decompile them. But it doesn't make any difference. You shouldn't be concerned that somebody is going to decompile your code because your code is doing nothing. It's calling APIs, and your code doesn't have the secrets in it. Your code is just UI code. That's it. Now, if you build an API such that it takes a password and you hard code a password as one of the options into your endpoint, that would be bad. Okay? So you do have to think about these things. But if you're following the right rules and being a good coder and following the standards, it should just be UI code. And this is one thing that I didn't mention, that WebAssembly applications run in the same sandbox, the same security model that JavaScript runs in. So the rule of thumb is, if I can't do it in JavaScript, I can't do it in WebAssembly. Guessing WebAssembly isn't supported in IE 11. You are correct, sir. I think I mentioned that before you jumped on. But yes, Tom, WebAssembly stopped development and stopped innovating before, I'm sorry, Internet Explorer stopped development before WebAssembly. And so Edge has it, Internet Explorer doesn't. Yeah. So you're probably going to need to use Blazor Server if your customers or clients or employees are hell-bent on using Internet Explorer 11. And even then, they have to use a polyfill. So any more questions on Blazor WebAssembly before we get into some meat? Some of the meaty stuff? Put on the music again. Let's go to the next song. This is my waiting for a question music. Is anyone using WebAssembly? Did you just ask, is anyone using WebAssembly? Did you really? No. No, nobody's using it. I take it you mean, is anyone using WebAssembly in a production project? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. I think I saw a website where there was a list of languages that are being used and a list of applications that you can run and download and use. One of the coolest things that I've seen was an asteroids game built in WebAssembly. It must have been C++ or something. I don't know what it was, but it's using, you know, the canvas, I guess, and JavaScript interop. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing, but yeah, it's there and it's prime time. But WebAssembly itself is good and it's baked. But if you're talking about Blazor WebAssembly, it still hasn't shipped yet, so I wouldn't expect any off-the-shelf products to be using it until November. Okay. All right, let's talk binding. With Blazor WebAssembly, we can use gRPC. Yes, yes, you can. Yes, gRPC or Google Remote Procedure Calls is a great technology that that Google has open sourced and shared with the world. And yes, you can. In fact, I started a project. I sat down to do a project, a file uploader using gRPC, and it only took me an hour. And I know the pattern really well of doing, you know, file uploading and all that stuff. So it really didn't take long at all. But yeah, you can use gRPC. It also turns out that a lot of people use gRPC because they think it's going to get them, more performance, you know, because it's a binary protocol, and so less data gets sent. But it turns out if you turn on, first of all, let me finish this and then I'll answer that question. If you turn on compression with API, you get the same performance. All right, somebody answered gRPC isn't supported in the browser. Yeah, it is. I did it. There is a gRPC solution for Blazor. Let me find it. Let's see. Yeah, I think this is it. Steve Sanderson, using gRPC web with Blazor WebAssembly. Yeah, I think if you just go to Steve Sanderson's blog and looked at it, in fact, this is exactly the code that I used to do the application. So yeah, it is there. And we'll get back to that in a minute. All right, binding. Binding is very, very easy and cool in Blazor. So rather than read this slide to you, I think what we'll do is just go in and do some binding. So I have my application here that we were using, and I've set the Okay, we're back. Yeah, I'm not sure what the problem was there, but it was definitely on my side. I saw my internet connection kind of barfed, and that was caused a little stream problem. So sorry, I apologize for that. Hopefully it won't happen again. All right, so what I've done here is I've gone back to our Blazor server application, and I've set the Blazor server as the default application. And I've gone back to debug mode, and we're going to close all these pages here. That's what I was doing. And we'll just go to our index page. And I have a replacement index page here that I will just copy over. And it's very simple. So we have a string, a message string property set to two-way bound message. And I'm using one-way binding here, just like we saw in the counter, in the the counter page. And I've also got a two-way binding with that same thing. So an input element, and we're binding the default property value, because the property isn't specified, it's the default property, to message. So let's see what happens here. All right, so I've got my two-way bound message, and I will change this, and I'll say updated. And now when I lose focus, or I press tab to lose focus, in this case, a DOM event on change occurs, and that is the default event that causes the data inside the input to bind to, or to update the message string, which then updates the UI, right? So if I hit tab, boom, now it's updated. So that is the default property, but I can change the default property. And I do that with @bind::event equals, and I'll change it from on change to on input. On input happens on every keystroke. So now, whenever I type a key, it will force what's in the input into message. Okay? Now what's happening here? Think about it. My input is in the browser, right? And yet something has to be changing on the server. Yeah, in fact it is. If we go to our network and press Control F5, we see our Blazor right there. Every key goes back to the server. Okay? So that's what's going on. We're going back to the server with every keystroke. Just so you know, now the latency is pretty good, but it's all on the server. All right, so we can be a little more explicit here with bind. I can specify the property that I want to bind to, the property of the input element. By default, it's value. And so if I just specify bind dash value, and I have to do it here for the event too. All right, this is the same, except if I leave dash value off, we're using the default property. We're binding to the default property instead of explicitly. But that does the same thing. All right, now we're going to build our first component, and we're going to bind to that component. So we have index, which is our parent page, and then we have a component, which I'll create now. And components generally in a Blazor project go in this shared folder. And I don't think it's named quite right. It should be a components folder, because main layout and nav menu are used in the layout of every page. And I guess they're shared, but survey prompts certainly, well, it is shared between two pages. Maybe you need a components folder. I don't know. I'll put it in the shared folder anyway. So we're going to add a Razor component. Right click, add on the shared folder, then select Razor component. And so whether it's a page in the pages folder or a component in the shared folder, it starts as a Razor component. And I'll call this child component. Right there, child component. Okay, so let's get rid of this and pull in some code here. Here's my child component. So let's start with the markup. It's just a div, and I have some inline styling here. I'm setting a little padding, background light gray, so that when we look at it, we can definitely tell, oh yeah, that's the component. Now I have a parent message string property and a button that calls update message to change the message. And update message raises an event. So this is what we get. Let's start with parameter. What is that? Well, parameter is an attribute that you put on any property or event callback that you want to expose to the parent. And so it can be defined declaratively when you instantiate the component, and you can also access them like properties if you have a reference to the component, which I'll show you a little bit later. Look at how elegant the event syntax is. Event callback. All right, event callback of whatever we're passing. So event callback of string, message change. That's how we define an event. To raise it, we need to be async. So just you can modify any, in this case, it's a button click handler, was void before in the counter. Just change it to async task, and now you're async. So we're calling await message changed. That's our event, dot invoke async. And what do I want to pass? Parent message. So what happens is when the button is clicked, this update message is called. We change parent message to Blazor. We raise the event. All right, now let's see how we can handle this in the index app. All right, so this is the only thing that we added here. This is it. An instantiation of the child component. Now here's what we're doing with child component. We're binding its parent message property, right, to our message property. All right. So we're binding child component parent message to our message. Got that? But instead of adding an event handler for message changed, we're making message change the event that forces the parent message out of the child component and into our message. All right? So that essentially updates the whole dang thing. Let's give it a go, shall we? So I've still got on key press, right? Now if I change it from within the component, boom, it changes in the component, which raises the event, and that forces our message to change, which it changes here, and it changes here. Very cool. And we'll learn a little bit about more about components in just a little bit. All right, so let's talk about state. Handling state. So if you're going to scale out, like I said before, you definitely need to move the state or page variables or whatever you want to call all the data that your code in the page accesses. You want to move that out of the page and out of the application, actually. You want a place to store it and retrieve it. And you store it whenever it's changed, and you retrieve it when the page loads. Okay? So the first thing that we have to do is get it out of the page. Remember I showed you that deal with the counter project, the counter page, and whenever you click the counter button, right? Let's do it right here. Go to the counter page and click the button, and then navigate back, away, and then back. The current count goes back to 0. That's because every page on navigation gets reinitialized. And that means everything just comes into being again, and the current count gets reset to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to find a way to move this. This is the only piece of data that we're actually using here, current count. We're going to move that outside the page. And that's the first step before we can scale out, before we can store it somewhere. So if we're going to store it, let's put it in a class. So I'll add a class to the project, and I'll call this app state. And app state's going to have but one property, counter. And now how do we access that in counter? Because I don't want to just new up an app state here. I want an app state to live in the application outside this page. Well, to do that, we go to startup and we register it as a service. So in configure services, we go services.add-scoped app state. Now let's look at this for a second. We already have a weather forecast service, and I already showed you that. This is Blazor server now. We have this weather forecast service, but it's a singleton. And in a Blazor server application, a singleton instantiates once, and all the clients share that one instance of the singleton. Okay? If it's a scoped service, then we create a new instance for every client. Scoped, new instance for every client. So every client gets their own instance. And that means, yes, I can inject that wherever I want, in whatever pages I want, and I'm going to get the same instance for that user. Wouldn't want to do it as a singleton. That's not state, that's shared among clients. Yeah, that's so in web forms parlance, this is like your application object. This is like your session object. Okay? So let's go and inject it. We'll inject it into the counter page. Here's the type, app state. Here's the variable, app state. Now this doesn't instantiate it. Again, this gives me access to the instance, access to the instance that we've already defined. In this case, it's a scoped instance. So now I can totally get rid of this current count right here. And instead, we're going to increment appstate.counter, and we'll show appstate.counter as the current count. So this is step one, right? Move it out of the page. Here's my counter. Now I've incremented it to 5. Let's go fetch some data, go home, come back, and the counter is still 5. All right. Now what's the next step? Well, the next step is storing that somewhere, because I want to serialize app state and I want to store it somewhere where I can reload it the next time this page loads up. Because I have stuff that I'm working on. Let's say I have a server farm. Oh, there's something I haven't heard in a long time. A web farm. We call them clusters these days. But I have a Kubernetes cluster of Docker containers, and each of them are running a Blazor server application. So when I click one button, I go to my Azure SignalR service, and it might send me to a completely different server, right? So that server is going to have to go get the state and figure out, where I am. So I have a couple of options. If it's just a little bit of code, I can persist it in local storage. And again, if you go to my blog, blog.appvnext.com, and you look for local storage, you'll see there's this shopping cart example where I show you how to take a shopping cart object that contains, items, products, and quantities, and serialize it and then store it in local storage. And then when the page loads back up again, it loads it from local storage, and then there's a timeout. And it's 30 seconds by default because, just to do the test, basically you can close it down, load it back up within 30 seconds, and it still runs. It's all still there. And if you wait after 30 seconds, it goes away. But if you have more than, a couple of K worth of data, you don't want to store it in local storage because now you have the view state problem. The view state problem of web forms is that you're constantly sending the state of the page back and forth between the client and server. Local storage is in the browser. Ultimately, it has to get to the server and then go back down to the browser in the form of, objects that are bound with the UI. So you don't want to do this for very much data. You want to think about a database. Well, what kind of database? Well, definitely not, well, I won't say definitely, but SQL Server and relational databases are overkill. Cosmos DB is overkill. Even though it's very fast, it's also expensive. Yes, they have a free layer and all that stuff, but that's fine. But you're probably talking about a document database, MongoDB, RavenDB, something like that. Heck, if you even set up your own server and had a file-based serialization thing where you had user ID, GUID, key, value pair that you just pulled up, I mean, that's really all that you need. You need some place outside of the server to store data. Okay, so now this is the cool thing that you've been waiting for. Developing a Blazor client and a Blazor server app simultaneously. We need more details about cascading value. Yeah, cascading parameters and cascading values are essentially those that you can access. Instead of injecting in every page, they cascade down the component tree. So if you have your page and then you have this component and that component and another component and you have several components, they all can have access to this cascading parameter. So you put the cascading parameter on where you would normally put a parameter, and whatever that is, now you have access to it. So that's what that is. So here's what we're going to do. Rather than reading the slide, we're just going to go and do it. So I think I outlined how we do this before, but just in case you don't remember, we're going to develop a Blazor server application that uses the Blazor WASM client code base, the counter, fetch data, index, whatever classes we have, whatever code we have. In here, we're going to use it from the server side. And then we can run both of these at the same time. So one code base shared in both environments. The first thing I do is on my Blazor server application, I'm going to add a project reference to Blazor WASM client and Blazor WASM shared. Ahmed, hold that thought. I will get back to you in just a minute. So these two projects we need a reference to in Blazor WASM client, Blazor WASM shared. This is where the code is. This is where the models are. All right. Now that we have that, let's open up on the server side underscore host CSHTML. Let's just look at this for a minute, right? We've got an HTML document here with our header, cascading style sheets, all of my links and metadata there. And then this div right here is for unhandled exceptions. Anytime we have an unhandled exception, it shows a little error message here. And then we have our script for handling the DOM. Okay. That leaves this app, component, type of app. This turns out represents all of the markup and code in your Blazor server application. If I change this to Blazor WASM.client.app, now I'm loading the markup and code from the Blazor WASM project on the server. And I also have to turn off pre-rendering. When pre-rendering is on, and it's on by default, there's a rendering that happens before the client connects, and then one that happens after. And so what you're going to see if you're hooking and overriding the lifecycle methods, you know, like on parameters set, on initialized, that kind of stuff, those are going to fire twice. And it can be a little strange if you're working along and you see, oh, I've got some initialization code here. I'm, you know, pulling data from a database. Oh, it's happening twice. That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's why. So if you set it to server, then it's going to behave normally. You don't get the optimization of pre-rendering, but you don't also have that wacky behavior. So now what I'm going to do is go to my solution properties, and I'm going to set multiple startup projects. One will be Blazor server. The other will be Blazor WASM server. All right. So this means when I press F5, both of these projects are going to start, and I'm going to get two browsers. The suspense is killing me. All right, now they both say, you can see I've got one that's zoomed in a little bit further than the other one. Okay, so they both say Blazor WASM right up here at the top, right? But in the tab itself, the one on the left says Blazor WASM, the one on the right says Blazor. All right, that's how you know where they're running. What happened? What happened? What happened? Don't tell me. Yes. I had a little hiccup again. Hope you're still with me. All right, so that's how you can tell. And I'm just going to wait a second to see if... Yes, I saw the stream hiccup. Yes. Okay. Good now? Good now. So this one over here on the left is running on the in the client, in the browser. Here's my counter. Here's my fetch data. This one is the same code that's running on the server. Here's my counter. Here's my fetch data. Oh, what happened there? What happened? Well, let's see. You can see an unhandled exception has occurred. Let's press F12 and find out what it was. So it turns out, yeah, cannot provide a value for property HTTP. All right, there is no registered service of type HTTP client. Do you remember the difference in fetch data between the server version and the client version? That's what's going on here. So we're not using this code on the server. We're using this code. And it's trying to inject an HTTP client. And on the server code doesn't have access to that because it's not in the environment. So let's add that. Services.addScoped HTML, system.net.http.http client. All right, now we can inject that no problem from both places. Okay. So now the second problem we have is going to occur here. The relative URL. And if I run this again, I promise you we're going to get another issue. And it's going to say another unhandled exception. It doesn't know what that is because on the client, it's fine. It's a relative URL to the API in Blazor WASM server. But we're trying to make a call from this server to that server, and it needs a absolute URI. So here's how you can get it. Now, it's all going to be local host, right? But we want the SSL port. So go to Properties, Launch Settings JSON of Blazor WASM server, and you'll see the SSL port right there in IIS settings. 44302. So now back in fetch data, we can make this a URL of HTTPS localhost colon 44302 weather forecast. And now everybody should be happy, happy, joy, joy. Now the takeaway here is that you have to have the same resources available in the environment that the code is running in. You can share the code, but you have to have access to the same resources, right? And those resources get loaded in the environment. So if it's on the server or if it's in the browser, doesn't matter, has to be there. JavaScript is another resource that has to be in both places if you're going to use this model. And that brings me to the question, why would I use this model? First of all, let's make sure that weather forecast fetch data works. Okay. Why do this, right? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, you can debug the code that is coming from the client code. You can debug it by running it on the server. So if I basically have all the debugging facilities available to me on the server that I don't have yet on the client, but that's not the biggest reason. The biggest reason is that I can build both applications simultaneously, and I can decide later which one I want to use, right? We may not know because there's a lot of unknowns. We haven't built test apps. We haven't done anything. Well, just build both, right? Build a client version and a server version. Now, the server version, you're not going to be able to do all the things that you want to do, all of those, take those shortcuts that you can take on the server, like calling a database directly. You have to build an API layer because the lowest common denominator is the WebAssembly app, right? But the thing is beautiful is that you can build both at the same time with the same code base and then decide later which one you want. Cool? Okay. That's a very, very cool thing. All right, so now I'm gonna show you this application called Band Booker, and it's a complete application, and I'm going to show off the following techniques. Code behind, which is using the power of Visual Studio. In other words, we're not going to have code blocks in our pages. We're going to have classes. We're going to make classes that handle the UI. Also, input validation. There's some rich input validation stuff that comes with Blazor, right in the box, out of the box, whatever you want to call it. And I'll show you how to do that. JavaScript interop. You can call JavaScript from C#. You can also call C# from JavaScript. So that's kind of cool. And generic components. The components that I showed you before, well, they were generic, but it didn't. The component that I showed you, that child component, didn't really do anything. But instead of instantiating data types inside the component and being locked into those data types, you create a generic component so that it will work with any kind of data that you want, any kind of data at all. And the third-party tools that you'll see out there from DevExpress and others, they're all generic. In other words, they're not opinionated about what kind of data they can work with. They work with anything, so long as it supports the interface that they use. Now, I'm also going to show you some authentication and authorization. And I built this code before WebAssembly had authorization and authentication built in. But also, it allows you to go one step further and use roles. So this is essentially taken from Chris Sainty's blog post. Chris Sainty is a very, very cool and smart blogger and MVP. He really gets into Blazor, and he's got a lot of great Blazor posts. And he showed basically how to do this. You create an API to register. It uses the ASP.NET Core identity. And you use another API to log in and log out. And logging in returns a JOT token that contains your claims and your security and all of that stuff. And then the client saves that into local storage. And then on loading, it pulls it out of local storage and sends it back and logs you in automatically. So this is all good stuff. Let's just go and take a look at the code. And I'm going to run the app first of all, show you what to expect and where the different technologies come into play, and then we'll dig into it a little bit. So first of all, and you know, this happens sometimes, you get an error and you just reload it, and it all has to do with just preview stuff. So notice that I'm logged in and it says hello Harry at harrychap.com. If I log out, I don't get to do anything, and everything's on the home page here. The counter and fetch data are just still there, ancillary, right? But all this stuff right here is only available to me if I register or log in. Otherwise I can't do anything. So there's some authorization code happening here. Okay, so over here you can see I just have a select or a list box for instruments and one for musicians, and some CRUD buttons, new, edit, and delete. So edit and delete buttons are disabled until I select something, and then I have them available to me. Now if I click edit, let's say, the select gets disabled because I don't want people clicking in here and selecting new things while I'm editing. Also, I don't know if you noticed this, but keyboards was selected and in focus and selected when I clicked on it. So click on this again, I can just start typing over it and everything works just fine. Now another thing you'll notice is that if I type in more than 50 characters, I get this validation message, the name is too long, and I can't update. Likewise, if I delete everything, it says the name field is required, and I still can't update. So those are the two rules that I'm implementing for the instrument name. Now if I select new, everything, the name field is in focus. Turns out in the current preview, or the current version of the component model, this is the focus is not surfaced to Blazor components. So I just talked to Dan Roth, and he said that yes, in .NET 5 they will surface focus, but right now you have to use JavaScript interop. Okay, question came up in Rich. Was it? No, Ahmed. Okay, Ahmed asked, when will we have to use state has changed method? So state has changed is a method on every component page or whatever, and it's sort of like your hello, something that is bound to has just been updated. And the rule of thumb is, if you don't need it, don't use it. If you need it, use it. And I can't tell you this situation exactly when I've had to call state has changed, but typically it's been like, let's say, you've got a SignalR hub and you're handling a SignalR message, and you change some property or some parameter or something that is bound, and you change it, and you notice that it doesn't update after you change it in your connection on handler for SignalR. That's when you throw in state has changed, and usually that does the trick. So rule of thumb is don't get into the habit of using it just because it's there. Most of the time, Blazor is going to take care of those changes for you. But if not, that's when you can force the issue. So I hope that answers your question, Ahmed. And thanks for that question. I did say I would get back to you, and I forgot. So thanks, John, for reminding me. Okay. So this is JavaScript interop. So far we've seen JavaScript interop at play, and we've seen validation at play. Let's take a look at the code and authorization too. This is the index file, or the index page. So you can see I've got an authorized view here. An authorized view essentially is a way to show markup that only for people who've been authorized. And so I have an authorized section, and if I scroll down, I have a not authorized section. Please register or log in to use this app. So that is pretty simple there. Now you can also use roles. You can say, you know, authorized view role equals blah, blah, blah. But there's actually, you can do it in code as well. If you get an authentication state provider, then you get the user and you get the user object and you can ask is in role. You get the claims principal. It's easily done with code as well. So just looking at this code right here, this is a list box or a select for the instruments. And I've got the code here. Instruments is a list of instrument objects, right? List of instrument. And I'm looping through each of them for each with it, you know, at for each. And if the selected instrument comes up in the list, I'm specifying an option with the selected attribute. Otherwise, I'm not specifying the selected attribute. And this is cool because I can set that selected instrument with code, and then when it redraws, it will be selected. So that's cool. What else can I tell you? On change, instrument selected. So that's how we handle a click when somebody selects something from the list. And I also can use the regular old DOM disabled and bind that to a Boolean. So I can change that Boolean disable instrument list to true, and that's how I can disable the whole select. Then I have some buttons, new, instrument, edit, and delete. And then I have this instrument editor. And the instrument editor is a component that is just for editing instruments. You pass it the instrument, and there's 3 event handlers, cancel pressed, instrument added, and instrument updated. And let's just look at instrument added. So this is a method in index, and by the way, yes, code behind. So this is an event handler, right? And I've specified the event handler on that component to pass an instrument. So yeah, code behind. This is how we do it. We create a file in add it to your pages folder. You want to do it for counter or fetch data or whatever, and name it the same as your Razor file, but put a CS extension on it. And then we make it a partial class, otherwise you'll have to change the name, and derive from component base, which is here, ASP.NET Core Components. And component base is the base for all pages and all components. And that's what has the life cycle on it. That's what has the state has changed method on it. That's got everything. The other thing that you need to do is make all of the items, all of the members that are going to be accessed from the UI protected, at least. They could be public, but they at least have to be protected. If you're going to make a call, you would use public. Like here's one. Oh, that's not true. I don't need to do that on code behind here. What I was thinking of was instrument editor. We haven't gotten to instrument editor yet. Let's do that. Let's go to instrument editor. So here's the instrument editor. All of the UI is predicated on this Boolean right here, show instrument panel. And these are the public methods, new instrument and edit instrument. And they're public because I want to have a reference to this component, and I want to call new instrument and edit instrument on it, right? And then I want them to raise the event instrument added, updated, in the component, and then handle that back in the page, which is where we just were. Instrument added, instrument updated, they're up here. Right? And this is where we would access, the API to add to the database and all of that stuff. You would do that in the page, not in the component. If you're using MVVM, which is possible, I'm not talking about it here, but that would be in the view model. So you'd create a view model for this page, and then the view model would access the data. Let's talk about that generic component, object picker. And it's part of musician editor. Musician editor in the musicians section, it's just exactly the same kind of select here, but we have a musician editor. And that, look at this ref. That's how I get a reference to a component, @ref equals, and then the name of a variable that is of that component type. So this is of type musician editor. All right, let's look at musician editor. So here I have the name of the musician, and then I have the object picker. I didn't actually show you what this UI looks like. We just looked at instruments. Let's look at musicians here. Here's Piano Patty. So I'm editing Piano Patty, and Piano Patty plays keyboards. So I'll double click on keyboards and it jumps over to this list. Now you've seen this UI before probably a million times, right? This is sorry, I shouldn't be looking at questions while I'm doing this. I'll take a minute to answer your question in a minute. So this is the UI I've seen a bunch of times where you have all the items on the left, selected items on the right, and then you can move items back and forth. You know, all items, selected items, just double click on an item, whatever it is, right? But we know that Piano Patty plays keyboards. So that's how we do that. This is the object picker right here. And it shows all instruments and selected instruments as well. So here we're passing in all items, all instruments, selected items, musicians' instruments. Item type and item type plural are both strings used for UI only. Instrument and instruments. The text property and value properties. So these are the names of the properties for the text or what you want to display. So that's the name property, and the value which identifies it, and that's ID. All right, so before we get into that, let me answer this question. Do people send view models in API calls? Send entire view models, like get view model from API, and it sends me a JSON and I instantiate that? I don't know. I've never done that. Why would you do that? I guess that's what I'm curious as to do. I mean, I would get the data that's in the view model, but you have to bind the view model in advance. I'm not sure I would do that whole thing. I'm trying to think of a reason why I couldn't do it. I just don't know why I would want to, but interesting question. All right, I'm going to get back to object picker. That when I sort of looked up and glanced at that question, it kind of just got me thinking. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Let's see. Object picker, here it is. So it's a table, right? It's a table with one row has all the items. Another row has, one column. The column on the left has all the items, then the buttons, and then the selected items on the right. But this guy right here, type param, is the key. This says essentially, hey, when I define T item, that's my T, right? That's my generic. And so you come down to pass the lists to the parameters. And let's look at these parameters. So item type and type plural, that's just instrument and instruments. Text property name is name, value is ID. Here we go. All items is a list of T item. So when I pass in all my instruments, my instrument list, now T item becomes instrument. And here's selected items, and here's a T item by itself, a private member. Oh, wait a minute. Let me get out of the way. There it is, right there. T item, selected item. All right, so how do we work with this? I mean, you saw how I selected the selected item and found out if it was to use selected here, right? but we don't know what it is, so we have to call a method. And I got some helper methods here, item value and item text. So let's look at those. And I'm just doing reflection. So I'm passing the item. For the text, I'm getting the property. That is the text property name, whatever that is. Getting the value, returning it. Simple. So that's how we do generics. Let's talk JavaScript interop. So in the instrument editor, for example, when you see new instrument and edit instrument, and I want to show the UI, because remember it's all predicated on this show instrument panel, but I want to also set this input text here, and we'll talk about that's part of validation. I want to set that into focus. So I have to do a couple things. First of all, I'm going to inject an IJS runtime, and that is for doing JavaScript interop. And then I'm going to give my text field an ID, and then I'm going to call the JavaScript function setFocus, which I've written, passing the ID, and that's awaited. It's invoke void because it doesn't return anything. If I wanted to invoke something that returned a value, I'd call invoke async of whatever it's returning, string or whatever. So let's go to where that JavaScript lives. Well, it lives in two places. It lives in the client, on the client side, in webroot index.html. That's where it is right there. And on the server side, because remember, this is part of the environment, it lives in our old friend _host. But it's the same JavaScript. It has to be in both places. Remember, the rule is all of the resources that are available in the environment have to be the same in both places. And this is definitely in the browser, so it has to be in both places. So JavaScript, setFocus. This is how we do a JavaScript method that we can call from interop. Now, why am I doing this crazy Rube Goldberg thing here? First of all, let me explain the code, and then I'll tell you why. So I'm calling an internal focus function from setFocus after a timeout of 10 milliseconds. So I'm saying wait 10 milliseconds, then call internal focus. Internal focus tries to get an element reference of that ID, and it might be null. Why could it possibly be null? Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. But if it is null, I'm going to call myself again in another 10 milliseconds and exit. All right? But if I get a reference and it's not null, then I'll call focus and select on it. So why is this happening? Let us take a look. Instrument editor. All right, so what happens is, and this is a problem in most spas, it's the problem of that don't exist yet. At the time I'm calling this JavaScript, show instrument panel has just been set to true, but the page hasn't redrawn itself. It hasn't re-rendered. So this whole div here doesn't exist, and this input doesn't exist. So I have to wait until that exists. So here's something somebody suggested I do. You can, remember I told you about these lifecycle events. You can override them. They're virtual methods. And one of them is on initialized, on parameters set, and then on after render. And on after render happens after the page renders. So Carl, why don't you just call your JavaScript to set focus right in here in your component? Well, yeah, that would work, but it would work every time for every refresh. Okay, I could see if it's the first render I don't want to do it, but now I have to have other logic in here to support when I'm going to make that call, and that is crazy pants. Crazy pants! So I would much rather do it my way. I only want to call focus once. After I show new instrument and edit instrument. That's it. That's the only time. All right, let's get to validation. And then I see some questions up there. I'll get to them. Let's get up to validation. So this edit form right here is required if you're going to do any validation with Blazor. You can, you have your submit button and you have your form and all that stuff. And basically all it's doing is saying we're not going to call this onValid submit or this submit button press method until all of the validations pass. All right, you saw I tried to click update and add and it wouldn't let me if there was a validation error. The data annotations validator says go and get the rules for validation from the model itself. So let's look at the model, and that's in my shared folder, right? My shared project. Here's the model for instrument. I'm using system component model data annotations. It's a NuGet package. You can add it. And I've said on the name property that it's required and the maximum length is 50, and here's the error message. There's all sorts of things you can do. I can if I had an email address, I know doesn't make any sense here, but if I had, say, email get set, I could put an email address data annotation there. And then it would validate against, is this a valid email address? It's very powerful. All right, so back here. I guess you're wondering what input text is. Here's the validation summary that just shows the stuff in red. You can also have validation messages next to each field. Okay, so input text is a validation aware one of these. All right, so it is essentially an input, but the Blazor guys have subclassed it and added all of the stuff that they need for validation. That's it. So we're binding the edit instrument name to that, and now we have our submit button. The other thing that's interesting here is that within an edit form, if I have another button like cancel, I have to specify it as type button. Otherwise, it's going to be considered a submit button. And that is just about all I want to talk about for band booker. So let's look at the questions. About the view models question. The reason why I want to send view model objects into APIs because I don't want my WebAssembly project to have models. I don't want users to know the structure of the database tables. Well, here's the deal. This is a good, consider I'm working on Blazor WebAssembly ASP.NET Core hosted project. Okay. So here's the deal. If you in a perfect world, you would make 2 models for every table. Well, not for every table. You have entities, which are the models that the database uses, but those shouldn't be sent to the client. You should also have a model just for the client. Okay, and you call those models. The entity is what the database, the database uses on the back end that has foreign keys and all of that stuff, right? But then you create another one that's a model, and it just has the data that the client needs. All right, anything that it needs, and nothing more. It doesn't need foreign keys, right? If you have an object that has a collection of other objects, you just make it a sub-collection. There don't need to be any IDs in there, right? If you're going to update them, yeah, you need IDs, but you don't need foreign keys and things like that. And you certainly don't need things that are only required for the database. Does that make sense? So I guess if you architect it correctly, you're not exposing the table structure of your database to the client. You can have a completely different model for the purposes of the UI, and you should in a perfect world. Doesn't mean we always do that. In fact, the question indicates that this isn't a habit we're in that we all have. But I've worked on big projects and big companies, and this is what they do. And then there's inheritance there. If you want, you can have your models, your entities inherit from the model, or vice versa. Do I have any thoughts on Octane framework initiated by Sean Walker? No, but I know that Sean Walker is a genius, and I haven't seen that yet. He's told me about it, but I haven't seen it. We got to have him back on .NET Rocks. That's for sure. Thanks. Thanks, Tom. And glad I can answer that question. All right, so if you're deploying to Azure, you can, and if you're using Visual Studio to create a new app service in Azure, then that's fine. It's all going to work great. Visual Studio is going to ask you to turn on WebSockets, and you say yes. But if you're using a new app service, and if you create an app service beforehand and you want to use that, you download the publish profile and all that stuff, make sure that you turn on WebSockets in the app service properties. It's in the configuration general properties. It's just a switch. Use WebSockets. And that's cool. That's all you need to do. So we talked about DevExpress stuff in the beginning of the talk, and I just want to take a moment to show you some of their components because they're free and they're really cool. I like their tools because they help me get stuff done that I don't have to write myself. I mean, I don't need another button. You know what I mean? I don't need all those primitives and stuff, but charts and schedules and data grids, man, just trying to write that stuff yourself is a nightmare. And I don't mean it's a nightmare. It'd be fun, but it would take a long, long time. And they have them, and they're free. And so here's the deal. You can download from devexpress.com/free Blazor right now their components for free, and you can use them forever. They're not going to expire on you. At some time in the future, they will move to a subscription model, but right now, they're free for the taking. So definitely worth going and getting. Let's take a look at some of the stuff that they have, and they're demos that you can run online. They've got all sorts of stuff, right? Hundreds and hundreds of products. So I'm going to click on the Blazor demos here and just pick one, the scheduler. I love the scheduler. The scheduler is like, it's like Google Calendar just dropped out of the sky into your app. I mean, look at this. This is a typical data set of dates and appointments, and I can just move them around UI-wise. I can, stack them, and I can add new ones. I can edit, like if I just click on one of these and I click edit, then I get all the stuff to edit, right? All of the things that you want. And you can delete items, and it jumped around because I changed the date. I can delete items, add, delete, update, edit, move, copy from one place to another, right? It's just easy. Here's the cool part, folks. That's it. That's all the code and markup you need. I'm just going to get out of the way so you can see, like, there's just a, it's just a couple semicolons there, but come on, you get all that just for that little bit of code. And yeah, you have to have your mapping, your appointment mapping, but that's it. I'm just really, really impressed with their tools. Here's the data grid, all sorts of things, paging. Remember I was telling you before that you want to keep memory low. Well, here's a demo of a large data source with 101,072 pages of data, and you can move through them virtually like no problem, right? Let me show you, in fact, there's a grid project that I've got here that they did. A band booker, essentially, I said to them, hey, make a version of band booker that does the same CRUD stuff that I'm doing, but just with a grid instead of the more complex list and editors and components and stuff that I have. And this is what they came up with. So you see 2 grids here, one for instrument and one for musician. And let's create a new instrument, and I'll call it conga. Update that. There it is right there. Let me edit it. Add an S. There it is right there. Congas. Let me delete one. Okay, so there's your CRUD stuff. Musicians. I'll create a new musician. Che, and then I'll click on instruments. It says select the instruments. Now I get this drop down list. And he plays conga, so I'll add him, and now I get this list. This other list. I can keep adding instruments, and notice that they don't show up in the list of possible instruments. So there we go. There's Che. And Che plays these instruments. Now I can edit. And there we have it. I can delete. So all of that CRUD stuff in a grid, and yeah, it doesn't have the same look and feel, but it gets done, right? And that's what enterprise developers are all about. Look at the markup here. This is it. Here's the markup for instruments right there. Here's the markup for musicians. There's a little bit more because we have that edit form template in the middle, but that's it. Not a whole lot. And now look at the code. Here's the code for handling instruments right there. And here's the code for handling musicians. Just getting it done. There's another thing that I wanted to show you, and that is list boxes. And this came out of a real necessity. I was building an application, and I wanted to do a multi-select list box. So I'm working on this, and I've created my coronavirus shutdown reading list. Practical snow melting for fun and profit, how to shave a cat, winning at tic-tac-toe. These are on my reading list, right? And so what I want is to be able to hold down the control key and select multiple ones, but I can't do that. Now I did find this open source, well, it's really a blog post. I found a blog post that this guy or gal wrote, and I'll show you this, and I implemented the code, and yes, indeed, it does. If I hold down Control or Shift, I'll hold down Shift, and I can select all of them. Does a multi-select list box, but let's take a look at what the difference is, right? So this is my code here for single select, and you'd think that you could just go multiple, and then on change book selected would just, this change event args would pass all of the items that were selected, but it doesn't. It doesn't at all. So this isn't supported in Blazor. Now, of course, when something isn't supported in Blazor, that means that's a challenge that you could write it yourself. Okay, well, that's what this person did. So here's their version that I just showed you. They made a select multiple component. All right, and here's all the stuff that you have to put on it. And it is bound to a list of strings called selected book IDs. Okay, and so you get the IDs of the books that are selected. And then I have to go through each one of those books and pull them out with link. And if it's not null, then I can show the ID, title, and description. But let's actually look at select multiple and see what they've done. And here's my credit, right? ASHKE98 on medium.com, and here's the link to the blog post. It's pretty ingenious, actually. So here's the select, and we have the cascading value here, which Ahmed asked me about. This is a child content is a render fragment, and this is render fragments are how you handle pieces of markup. Let's put it there. Let's leave it there. And so now we've got all these other parameters, and I'm also noticing that the colors are going away, and that's because something happened. I don't know what happened, but Visual Studio didn't like it. So you just close it and load it up again, give it enough time to think about it, and then maybe they'll go green sometime in the future. Maybe. Maybe not. All right, so anyway, you've got a T list of item, of values. You've got some generic stuff because this is a generic component. We have a type param T item at the top. Oh, and we're using JavaScript. Look at all this code here. This JavaScript right here on option select is actually JS invocable. That means it's going to be called from JavaScript. So let's go into the JavaScript page, and that's underscore host CSHTML. And you can see all the JavaScript here. Window drop down, we have 3 layers of if, a lot of cyclomatic complexity here, going through a loop, getting the selected values, and here's on option select, which we pass our .NET object, and then we're invoking that. So we're calling C# from JavaScript. Wow. And that's how that works. So then I went looking at DevExpress, and I found a much easier solution in their free listbox control, which Don Webier is going to explain to us now. Hi, Don.
Hey, Carl.
Hey.
That was a decent amount of work getting that multi-select feature enabled.
Yeah.
But fortunately, there are easier ways of doing so. By using the native DevExpress Blazor controls. And let me show you how simple that works. I have this page over here, and I have only prepared this property which will hold the selected books of the list box. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert the DevExpress list box here, where I will bind the data to the book service. And I'll specify a text field name, which will be in this case the property name, which will be displayed inside the list box. And then the last thing is I'm going to bind the selected items of the list box to the selected books property of the page. And this is basically all we need right now. Let me also include the code that you've seen before. There is one difference though, and that is instead of cycling through this list with IDs and stuff, you can now cycle directly through the selected books collection. And you can write out those property names straight away. So it's again a bit less code here. And once I run the application, let's see what happens now. If I go to the DevExpress demo, what we'll see is that we have the same UI as we had on the previous pages. The only thing right now is that if I hold down the Shift key or the Control key, it still selects 1. And that's actually quite simple solved, because right now the list box is in single selection mode.
Right.
If I go back to the code and I'll add a property which I will change to the list box selection mode multiple, we're all set. So let's run a demo again, and I will now be using my Control and my Shift key as well. And what you'll see is I can select items individually or deselect them, or I can even hold the Shift key to select the whole batch. So that's quite simple, huh? Yeah. And there is one more thing I'd like to show, and that is setting another property. And that property is going to be show checkboxes. I'm going to put it to true, and now all of you may guess what this will do. So let's run it again. And what we have now is a really nice list box with checkboxes. And for single selections, I don't even need to hold down the control key. But I can still use the shift key if I want. So if I want to select the whole batch, I'll just hold down the shift. So a very nice and powerful control.
Yeah, I'll say.
And yeah, if we check the amount of code that was needed to get this desired UI, I would say this is too much, right?
No, in fact, it's perfect. Thank you, Don. Thanks.
You're welcome, Carl. And we'll talk later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So, as I said before, go to devexpress.com/freeblazor to download your free Blazor controls right now. It's really good stuff. There's an upload control that does file chunking uploads. The charts are off the chart. Great charts. Again, that scheduler control, the grid control for meat and potatoes, stuff, data entry, CRUD stuff. Great. Of course, everything can be styled with Bootstrap. It's all good stuff, man. Go get it. And with that, I'm going to say, first of all, Johnny, I saw your question. If there exists any way to use open component in render fragment from any Razor component type, but just referring a partial segment in the component, I'm going to need a whiskey before I can answer that question, because that's a serious one. Send that to us at blazor@devexpress.com, and we'll see if we can answer that for you. Okay, Johnny? Thank you. And thank you for watching this presentation tonight. I'm Carl Franklin, and you know what? We'll see you out there next time. We're not going to be doing the Blazor Desk Show. We're going to be doing the Blazor Train, but it should be a lot of fun. We'll see you out there. Thanks a lot, everybody.